Welcome to the Practice Podcast, conversations probing the nature of practice. I'm your host, Dave Fearon. In this episode, Dave and I continue our conversation about the nature of practice as it is served by talk, by one's ability to talk their way forward with others. Sometimes talking others into things, sometimes being talked out of things, but quite a remarkable discovery in this conversation that most practices, if not all practices, which take place in a social system, in a very human, interactive environment, do require the practitioner to be good at and always get better at talking with others. Because that's where the inaction occurs. That's social inaction. Now, Dave is much smarter about this than I am, and he will put some caveats and qualifications in there. But the point of this conversation is how significant conversation is to anyone's practice. See if you agree. What I would think of as the rudiments of social inaction, something that we've named this research webpage about inaction. And I took the liberty when we were creating the page to say that social inaction, and particularly the focus on the nature of conversation, is a way of getting at also the nature of practice when speaking to or with, better than to, a practitioner. And yet I don't really know how that might work. So maybe in this conversation, you can help me and our listeners figure out a little bit more about what happens when people talk with each other, and particularly the issue or the topic being who they are and what they love to do.
Yeah, it would sort of be a departure from where the particular methodologies and theory that I was studying would get to, as far as getting to what someone in the business world or studying organization behavior where they would typically start. But I think it's important in terms of practice in particular, as a point of view, one that takes you more closely into the moment and also into what behavior might be that's special about human beings engaged in talk. And so where a lot of the theory comes from is a broader field typically called sociolinguistics that includes methodologies of conversation analysis and methodology, which are in essence trying to look at very broad topics of how talk and conversation works, and how it works, particularly for conversation analysis, how it works in very empirical ways, observable ways that people show each other what they mean, what they are doing, what they're engaged in moment to moment. And the method is to take recordings and look very closely at recordings and transcripts of recordings and come up with what at its basis might be a very detailed description of what someone's doing, but that becomes somewhat uninteresting in other contexts, such as how what's going on within an individual in their practice. But what you're doing is you're not starting out with abstractions. You're not starting out telling the story of what you just saw. You're looking at how it works moment for moment, how it develops. So I guess what we could do is maybe as we talk and come up maybe with examples or something, like we can try to reorient towards what it might mean to look at it in terms of this, look at the enacting of the practice as it's being done. And this, in the future, and ideally on the website, we'll put up some actual examples with bits of video and some analysis to get a better sense. But we'll do it in theater of the mind for now.
Well, as you were saying that, I recall a number of times that when Peter and I were discussing and conjecturing about the nature of the practice, he kept coming back again and again, as he should, to say, now, wait a minute, practice happens. We talk about practice as an it. We talk about it as a verb. But really, if you want to know the difference of practice in other behaviors, first and foremost, you have to observe it. You have to see practice happening, because otherwise it's just a thought, intention. Until it's put into action, there's nothing to see. And more importantly, for our way of thinking of practice, there's nothing to learn. Or if it's all in your mind, the doing is what distinguishes the frontier for the next thing you've got to do and the learning you're going to achieve. So in a way, practice as an individual behaving is iterative in a sense. But also what I'm doing right now is I'm trying to use the practice of conversation, of us give and take, to have us both, for our listeners, come up with some fresh ideas about conversation, about practice, or anything else that may pop up in the next few minutes as we talk.
Yeah, and I think when we're talking about an action, there's only so far. It isn't in. You can frame it as a theory of mind, in that you can kind of look at how we talk to ourselves as we're thinking and working and doing things, but it doesn't give any. There's not much we can do about that besides speculate how practice, as we sit at working at the computer, working out some sort of better way of doing something during the day, that as observers of practice, that won't do as much good. What we want to see is how, if you had real recordings or a direct observation of one or more people engaged in a meeting or practicing golf swings or something of that sort, and talking about it, then you both have, as an observer, you have something that you can observe, and you can also look at how participants in the interaction observe each other and talk and orient their talk to others. And I think that becomes the rudiments of where you would see practice of people in social interaction, engaging in social organization, that would then you could use that to think about how people, by themselves, are doing similar things just by being able to talk to themselves.
Yeah, and talk to others. One of the conjectures that Peter and I developed fairly early in our episodes was the notion that practice is almost always interactive. It really manifests itself through interaction, social interaction in particular, that you, in order to get done what you need to do, in most instances and contexts, you have to connect with other people who are significant to the direction you're going, maybe have the resource you need or the observation that you don't have. And so you, in a sense, use talk to move your practice forward. What do you think about that?
Yeah, it kind of brings to mind, if you were to think of how talk or how conversation evolved, it is something that requires a certain amount of effort, and also, let's see, if you think about it in a problem-solving way of, maybe I think some of the early pragmatist philosophers would think about this, where it helps resolve a situation by using words, even individually, to work something out, and that is an expression of working something out socially when words became part of what early humans could do. What you'll see are practice involves making the efforts of putting things into words and working them out. And if you were to do it by yourself, eventually you get to the point where you don't really need a lot of words. It becomes just more pure behavior, like the golf swing.
Mm-hmm.
When initially you're learning it by talking it through and analyzing and putting words to all the different body muscle movements and moves of the body. But then it kind of needs to go into something nonverbal to actually make it work. And in that sense, the golf swing becomes a practice. And to some extent, you could probably see aspects of that in other social organizations like groups, and not even things that are more purely, not necessarily operating a machine, but ways of coming up with the best price estimates on something or other.
Sure.
Eventually that's done with fewer words and acronyms and categories of talk that everyone in the room not only knows, but ought to know and holds each other accountable for knowing. And it becomes a certain economy of words and knowledge in practice, but it's one that initially has to be worked out more explicitly. And that's a very where humans are different from other animals in being able to do that in such complex ways. But like any other behavior, there's a tendency, it is a high energy, inefficient, in some ways, the high energy, inefficient act that then kind of gets smoothed down into the more habitual behaviors as soon as possible, which both increases the efficiency, but also can lead to other problems if there are moments when you really need to think about what you're doing and talk about it to others.
That's a great point. It reminds me of the era that we're living in right now. I had a couple of weeks of Zoom conversations with two different groups of management educators who were in virtual conferences. But the gist of both of those groups, from a standpoint of the practice of teaching, was, what the hell are we going to do now? There were people on there, some of who were early career, some mid-career, some late career, who had reached that point you were talking about a moment ago, Dave, where they didn't have much need to talk to anyone else about their method or situations in the classroom and materials they were using, even though that was the purpose of both of those societies. The purpose of both societies was to give people a ready, at-hand network of fellow practitioners of that sort with whom you could reach out and talk, or you could at least read their article as if you're hearing their voice in your head. But anyway, what I'm going to get to now, in terms of the need to talk, to keep a practice moving, is that as soon as you step out into a lot of uncertainty, in fact, uncertainty beyond uncertainty, seems to me that any sort of practitioner now has to start talking again. What do you think about that? In other words, talk is sort of the way of moving into and through not only problems, but whole nests of problems.
I mean, it would have to be, because what else do we have as humans? There's only so far you go with flailing your arms around, or throwing rocks at each other. You can't, we rely on talk, and we haven't developed telepathy yet, so that's what we have. But there's such a richness of talk that people don't even recognize until you really see, for example, gestures and eye movements, and now the difference between doing meetings on Zoom and only, at least you could see a face, but you can also see people looking away doing their email at the same time. There's a whole different medium now where people are having to adjust to that. And then in the classroom, yet again, I've done presentations and it's like you're talking into the void, even if you can see people on the screen. As far as
it's true,
it's a very different experience. So,
in the larger meaning of talk, there's talk that you do without words. In a sense, it's the nonverbals, the gesturing, the body posture, the movement of eyes that I think are associated with people who are moving into troubled waters as well, though, because your whole body language changes as you're moving into troubled waters. your breath changes, you're flailing a little bit, and someone looks over and says, "Hey, Dave, what's up? What's going on?" Well, I just can't make this thing work anymore. I've been doing it. I've perfected. I published it, and now I'm trying to use the same thing, and it's not working. So what do you do from there, Dave? When someone says, what I knew and what I had tested and what I had proved that works is no longer working. What kind of conversation does that start?
Well, I don't know. It sounds like it starts a specific conversation, and I think we kind of started out with our conversation saying, well, it's very broad that we can. I mean, the traditions that I'm drawing from say, well, what's very broad? How they work that out is the same. May use many of the same tools that they would work out how to get, figure out what to eat for dinner. So what I'm trying to say is how much into the weeds do you want to get? Are they facing something that is fundamentally different than any other sort of problem solving that is done with the enlistment of conversation with others? And is that what we really want to figure out, or do we want to know something more general?
Well, both, because I think one becomes much more self-aware that he or she is in practice when the practice itself is not working the way it should. In other words, as you said earlier, you develop these lovely, initially through talking, you develop these habits. They become somewhat ingrained and they carry you forward, whether you're a physician or teacher or a golfer. And then you reach these moments where Peter Vail would say you're tumbling into white water and you're moving much faster and there are a lot more obstacles to steer around. At that point, being with someone else, even if neither of you know that much about what's ahead, I would think is in the weeds in a sense, but also it helps us understand when we really are moving our practices ahead, how important other people are in the moment. That was your in that.
Yeah. So if you really had a nice recording of people working that out, like if it were on a Zoom, we record the Zoom, and maybe you can even gather some of those in the future that we can look at.
Yeah.
You can see those moments, and what built up somewhat over the years is a toolbox of what to look for to some degree in terms of the dynamics. So you can look at the dynamics of people working out new definitions of the situation, new ways of rethinking words and what they were doing, what they thought was a theoretical point that then has to be put into practice. But you can also look at what are the dynamics of the social relationship.
Yes.
So what is the relationship between the two people who are talking at that moment? Is it two colleagues at different schools who are not in any competition, or are you talking to the assistant professor who may get to be chair before you or whatever, or has kind of had something in, or certainly within the workplace, you never know who's gunning for you. And that is
the other way around, someone who's rooting for you,
or even establishing that good relationship is a lot of very detailed, close work, which one of my teachers, Tom Sheff, looked at as and thought to be in an almost entirely parallel, but somewhat uniquely, distinctly self-organizing aspect of talk that no one really knows how to look at well, but in as important as being able to use words that have the same symbolic meaning amongst the participants is the ability to negotiate the quality of the social relationship in the moment with every word, and knowing how to, and that's a lifetime of study in itself to figure it out, which I only scratched the surface of the back in the day, but it's one that's and the key dynamic is around the emotions of embarrassment and shame,
Right.
and pride and respect, and on the other side, and and that becomes, once you kind of learn how to look for that, it's really deeply tied into problem solving and other aspects that you might be looking at.
I think it brings up a very significant aspect of what practice is, in that when we are in a state of practice, we are in that state of practice. In other words, we're all in. One doesn't say, if I play golf today, I'm only going to put half of my attention into the next shot. I'm only going to, you can't negotiate with yourself. And particularly even your emotions, your feelings. Okay, calm down. Remember, we talked about meditation as a practice and how important that is. But if one doesn't understand the inner somewhat turmoil and sometimes other aspects inside when one is moving a practice ahead, then their ability to find the right quality of social relationships is somewhat impaired. So I think Peter said in his very last conversation that I recorded with him that the more you look into the human nature of practice, and that's the key word, the more intriguing it is. To the point, and this is the point he made. It's so much a part of a person that they don't even know the depth of their own practice or the nature of their own practice. He talked about, the 30-second elevator speech when someone says, I'm a doctor and I practice, oncology. That's not the practice. That's just a simple way, a shorthand. But a doctor in a moment with a patient, as an oncologist, at the point where he is telling the patient, well, you've got 6 months to live, very different. And that's what it keeps the practice rich. But also, as the doctor tries that out, it's a talk, it's a crucial talk. I have to help this patient understand what I mean by 6 months.
Right.
I mean, I'm drifting a little bit here, but
it's a talk with a methodology, and
there's a discipline to it, sure.
Discipline is a real method, and it's one that's probably shared by others in the field in a particular way, even one that they may have learned to some extent or
train. Yeah, they train.
They train to some extent. They pick up and learn in other ways. But it's one that has a lot of power. Like I've heard the phrase used: nutrition has no relationship to cancer, whether you get better with cancer. I've heard that phrase used by an oncologist, which is a false statement. It doesn't bear evidence, but they're doing something with it. They're trying to do something.
Which then influences the listener, who then says, oh, great, I can eat anything I want. The cancer must have been caused by something else. So that puts out for those two people, it puts them out on a very different path.
Yeah.
And if that oncologist had different information to believe in part. So
so if you had that little moment on recording, you could start spinning off all kinds of themes of analysis of power and knowledge but you could also see how it's done at that moment and how the conversation progresses over time. It would all be very interesting.
We are back to where we started, and we got a few more minutes. But again, practice, in my words, and I'm not as good with the words as you are, that this moment that you and I are in right now, we're in a state of practice. I am, on behalf of people I hope are listening to this in the future, I am more than having just a casual conversation with my son. You and I are trying to both understand each other in this moment, but I toss out scenarios, and you're working it out in your perspective, and together we may have something different in the next 3 minutes because of this moment.
Yeah. I'm still, and because we're talking and you're asking me things, I'm resurrecting stuff I haven't worked on for 15 years.
Yeah. So, but there's another dimension of practice. I don't know where I read it. Maybe I said it, but we bring our entire life history into the moment.
Yeah, yeah. And
and your mind quickly dredges out stuff that you spent a lot of time understanding in depth during your doctoral studies, but you didn't even know how much you had there in terms of those words and so forth until I needed.
yeah,
See, that's the difference.
yeah,
I needed those words, and that's what
right.
brought them out.
Yeah, and I think it's a little different than, we also played golf, which I hadn't played in 5 years, and somehow my body remembers how to do a golf swing. Not great, but it remembers. And but that seems, I think the two things are certainly related as far as what's that implicit knowledge that you built up that's there in reserve. I think in some ways that, knowing how to express these ideas is similar to muscle memory at some level, but at another level, it might be different enough that it'd be interesting to know what that difference is.
Yeah, well, I think that another aspect that comes to my mind is that a practitioner, let's say practitioner X, has become quite proficient and has experienced quite a bit of success. So in order for that practitioner to grow, what would he do? He would seek out someone to serve who had a much more challenging, complex, less easily knowable condition, and would look forward to that and would then engage in the exploratory part of the conversation, and eventually it gets to resolution. At the end, that person has been better served because that was the perspective, the attitude of the practitioner is, I really want to learn something here. I'm not going to fake it. I'm not like you. I'm not going to just pull out my handbook. I really want to learn something here. So I'm going to seek a tougher challenge, even if I risk failure.
Right. But generally you'll do so with someone who you at least know the basics. So if I've never played the guitar, I'm going to look for, Pat Metheny and say, all right, let's get to where you are. That's that's not the so it's more rich when you already have a lot of that shared ability to talk and understand the context and the unspoken parts and really kind of feel it and get to that point of kind of like the muscle memory level of interaction. I think if you saw the advanced novice and the practitioner interacting, you'd see a lot of that unspokenness in the moments to moments, and say, oh yeah, okay, oh yes, and then they bring up examples, and they bring up stories, and they'd be able to tell a story that both could really relate to, whereas you don't get that in people who are too distant on a particular topic.
I'm jumping back to Tom Sheff's moment, though, in this, that same practitioner who's decided he's going to make a stretch and move out into something a lot more challenging than he or she's used to, that brings up the potential of shame. That brings pride and puts pride on the table. Yeah. Those two factors that you learned so well. And also the whole, this, I know this could be a whole other podcast, so I'm just going to throw it out there. It also, from my mind, requires them to create a rather instantaneous social bond. If there's going to be that much risk-taking on the part of the novice and the expert, but the expert who understands that novice is into something not as easily understood, then they got to overcome those bad motions. They got to come up with the good ones. They have to form a social bond. Talk a little bit about social bond for a moment. We'll come back to it in another podcast. And
it gets away into some of those ideas that you pick up in the book on Buddhism, and to some degree, what is humility? What is compassion? What is what is embarrassment in a way that is helpful, not something to be only avoided? What is pride in a way that's constructive and not something to be ashamed of, as a functioning of a good group? So it does seem like there's a lot to being social that relies on quality of relationships, and with very particular emotions that show up on your face, change the color of your skin to red if you get embarrassed, are in the very details of the voice, and ones that probably preceded, I think I don't know if I've seen studies of chimps or whatnot having those be part of our gestural language, but it certainly is one that's carried forward. And
right.
So there's a lot to it, and there's potentially dynamics that could be looked into, and I think are dynamics that are actively exploited in the world by the news media, by politicians too. So you can get into that fun area as well.
What is the social bond?
The social bond. Well, it's I think kind of spinning maybe a little bit from what Tom Sheffield and his wife Suzanne Retzinger came up with. I don't have it in front of me to find it. I think of it as more active than social relationship. You can think of a relationship in abstract terms,
a marriage,
state, a category of state over time. But think of social bond in an action framework as what's being done in the moment. What is the bonding? What is the moment-to-moment improvement? And you could the very broadest ways to think of it is in terms of social distance, closeness, and distance. In a metaphorical sense, but it may be one that's even semi-behavioral, being too close to a person or further away. If someone's ashamed, they want to hide, they want to move away, they want to be and may be actively pushed away from the group, in a tribal sense, sent out into the forest.
Yeah.
In the worst cases, or being close, huddled together and acting in solidarity. So that closeness and distance becomes a very direct metaphor. It's one that you can even start to look at in even the words that people use, and in particular behaviors such as becoming ashamed and then becoming angry. That's a very particular sort of behavioral sequence that you can see happen quite a lot, especially.
Oh yeah, particularly in whenever
arguments.
Everyone's feeling raw, if you will, because of the conditions we're in, and everyone has different views. But I want one last time on this conversation move back to importance of social bonding in practice, because as I said a moment before, one, depending on what one's practice is, what they're trying to do, they're going to be always in a social system. It's inevitable that there are going to be people in various roles around them. And so the folks that I've had conversations with so far in the podcast, I've known in part as being very, very successful at adapting and creating a state of rapport, even trust, and doing that rather rapidly. For example, there's a whole category of people in our field, organization developers, several of whom I've had conversations with, Steve Cady, Matt Minahan, and others, whose work is to move into a troubled social system, organization or subsystem of an organization, and start diagnosing and figuring out what's going on. And in order to do that, they have to talk to people, and they have to listen in a certain way, and have to observe in a certain way. So it's really putting themselves deep into, the heart of the beast, and with the intention that you're going to help others come out of it and come through it. That's what Peter did a lot of in his career. It's something that takes a tremendous amount of practice. But if they weren't well developed, if they hadn't developed themselves to the extent that they could do that, it would be a dismal failure.
Yeah.
Because they'd get angry, people would get angry, out the door you go, we're not even going to pay your bill.
Right. And people are thrust in those kind of leadership roles all the time without having any of those skills. It does take a personality and practice to get to that point. But also some fundamentals. What is, ego, humility, again, things of that sort that therapy may help with ultimately, but there's certainly ranges of personalities that make that more or less difficult to overcome in the different settings.
So I think we've got a couple of things done here. First, I think we've taken a look at practice as it happens and recognizing that until it's being done and observable, you can only guess at what's going on. And even then, you still have to guess, but at least you got some evidence of the eye that you can say, okay, this is a golfer. This is a teacher. It looks like the teaching behavior. But then to get further into that, you have to recognize that that person is constantly learning and needs others to help with that learning. Sometimes just to reinforce what they already know and can do on almost at a habit level. Like Tiger Woods, I believe, still has a swing coach, maybe 3 swing coaches. And so there's, even when you think it's muscle memory, they don't take any chances, all the way through to the whole field of executive coaching, where, you're just basically calling on a person periodically, regularly, and saying, I'm beleaguered here, help me think this through. Talk is the key, though, and that's where you came in on this whole venture. Talk is instrumental in almost anything anyone in any sort of practice needs to get done.
And we've added something, talk plus the hidden dimension of managing social relationships.
There you go. But how do you get to one without the other? I mean, that's really an interesting conversation for the future.
They're both there, but we revealed that secret too early. We should have charged for that. But I haven't told you how, so we'll save that for the premium.
Yeah, we're going to get to a subscription level eventually, where if you really want to get to because I think we're onto something. I think we can make some serious money here. No, I'm just kidding. But it's funny, all the years. Yeah, all the years you were working on that doctorate, and do I really need to know this stuff eventually? And now here it is, and you're bringing stuff back to mind to help me, and therefore our listeners, get another aspect in their heads about the nature of talk, the human nature of talk. So thanks a lot, Dave, and I look forward to our next conversation.
Me too.
Thanks for listening to the Practice Podcast, where we discuss practice with a capital P. If you'd like to hear more, listen in on Spotify, Podomatic, and Apple Podcasts, or go to inactionresearch.com/podcast-page. And if you'd like to learn more about social inaction and the nature of practice, head over to inactionresearch.com for more information. Thank you for supporting this show. We look forward to hearing from you soon.